everyone, my name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Today we are going to be going back to another one of everybody's favorite subjects, punishments. In particular, we're going to be looking at alternatives to physical punishment, also known as corporal punishment, and how to make those alternatives work in your DS relationship. When we think of discipline in a power exchange dynamic, the classic things that many of us picture are ideas like spanking or caning. It might also be more traditional boarding school implements like maybe a paddle. And if you were to look at, say, BDSM pornography or popular posts on FetLife, you would certainly be left with the impression that that is how discipline looks in BDSM relationships. Heck, if you even go to a munch, you'll probably run into people that are talking about how intense their last punishment scene was, or how they were hit so hard the last time that they broke a rule that they saw stars. However, I'm here to tell you that not all discipline, not all power exchange relationships have to look like that or feature those things. Now, I have plenty of other videos talking about this in detail, so I will link them down below, but just to give a quick summary, what punishment is supposed to be in BDSM is a deterrent for unwanted behavior. Usually what this means is trying to deter somebody from breaking a rule. So for example, you might have a rule that you are not supposed to swear in front of your master, but then you say fuck or shit by accident, and so what ends up happening is you get 5 spankings to deter you from doing the same thing again. However, BDSM does have a lot of masochists in it, for example, and so right away going to those physical punishments to deter behavior doesn't always work. And in fact, it can actually make the problem worse because instead of deterring behavior, it encourages it because the masochist, the brat, actually is getting their needs fed by that physical punishment. Some people just also happen to call any pain-based activity in BDSM punishment, whether or not there's a power exchange element present or not. Some people like using it because it gives sort of a disciplinarian flavor to their scenes that they happen to enjoy, such as an outlet for bratting or resistance play. However, I think a more accurate term for these things where power exchange isn't being involved and you're not trying to use it as a behavior correction would be punishment, which can be especially helpful if you happen to have both of those things in your relationship at the same time. And what punishment basically is it is a faux punishment that is meant to be enjoyable rather than something that is used as an actual behavioral deterrent. But with all that being said, sometimes physical punishment isn't always the answer. Like I said before, if somebody is a really intense masochist and they like pretty much every kind of pain, they are always going to be rewarded by physical punishment, and it's not actually going to be able to serve its purpose in a DS relationship. Sometimes we have very profoundly negative associations or even trauma with things that makes it very difficult to separate out consensual BDSM from past abusive experiences. They might also negatively remind us of our childhoods. And most importantly, the relevant psychological research shows that physical punishment simply is not effective at deterring unwanted behavior in the long run. Instead, what it does is it tends to create an atmosphere of guilt and hiding and shame that instead makes it so the unwanted behavior goes underground instead of being eliminated entirely. And that fear of being punished can also seep into other areas of the relationship or into the fabric of the DS itself. And while I would say that members of the BDSM community may be more likely to respond positively to physical punishment compared to members of the general population, I don't think that means that it should be the default or only option. So then, what can we do if we want to spare the rod? As it turns out, we actually have a lot of options. And just as with methods of physical punishment, they can easily be incorporated into our existing relationships, helping to reinforce our role play roles, as well as reminding us of the status of the relationship. And so now I'll dive deeper into exactly what some of those alternative options are. Number one would be removal of privileges. I really like this one if you happen to have a dynamic with a little or a middle or maybe a slave that has to earn their privileges with good behavior. I think this could include things like restricting the amount of time one is allowed on their computer or internet or their favorite apps, maybe streaming websites or TV or video games. Now, as with all disciplinary action, I think the amount of time and the severity of the restriction should be proportional with the infraction. So, for example, I wouldn't say that it is appropriate to take away your submissive's computer for 2 weeks because they accidentally said a swear word once. Instead, I would recommend starting with shorter periods of time and working your way up if you find the lower amounts aren't effective. You would be surprised how remorseful people are when they suddenly can't scroll through Twitter for 2 days. Now, one important note here that I do want to make about privileges is that I do not advocate for restricting either all outside contact or privacy. I personally consider it a red flag of abuse if somebody is not allowed to call or text or email anybody from the outside world for days or weeks on end. And if you feel like you have to restrict that much to get your point across, you probably need to go with another disciplinary method or just revisit the rule in general. I also think that removing all forms of privacy is a similar red flag for abuse. I do not think that it is an appropriate punishment to say, remove the lock screens on all of somebody's devices or demand all of their passwords. If you have had problems with violating boundaries, aka cheating, the solution for that is not BDSM punishment, it is a couples therapist. Because frankly, you shouldn't be doing BDSM together at all if you can't trust each other. Number two would be a general category that I like to call healthy behaviors. And these are great because they serve a dual purpose in the relationship. They are not only punishments, but they also help cultivate healthier behaviors in your submissive. These would be things like no dessert after dinner, no fast food, no caffeine after 5 p.m., no soda, or having to have an earlier bedtime. Now, do keep in mind that a sudden earlier bedtime or no caffeine can make for a very cranky submissive, so be quite cautious with when and how long you're doing this for. Now, a one-time punishment is not going to be the way to deal with your partner's crippling 5 times a day addiction to Starbucks and Monster energy drinks, as that typically requires more intensive, purposeful work to be able to get through. But having punishments like this in general can be a surprisingly good way of reminding your submissive of the authority that you have in your dynamic. Number 3 would be classic timeout techniques. If you were ever disciplined as a child, at least if you were a child around the time that I was, you probably had to do at least one of these. This could be things like having to stand in the corner, having to press a quarter against the wall with your nose, being sent to your room, or the perennial classic, having to write lines or an essay explaining that what you did was wrong and that you will not repeat the same thing in the future. The purpose of these is that it really gives your submissive time to think about what they did and hopefully understand why the behavior was corrected. However, if your submissive is the type to sit and stew and get angrier or turn inward on themselves and beat themselves up for being punished, I would not recommend this type of punishment where they are left alone with their thoughts for long periods of time. However, this is a really great punishment for brats because it does the one thing that brats hate the most, which is deny them attention. So if you have been struggling to work with a brat, something like this can actually be a really, really good thing to do. Just be careful if somebody might also be able to eroticize the humiliation of being punished like a child, though. Number 4 would be extra chores. Unless your partner is a really dedicated service submissive, most people aren't super gung-ho about having tons of extra things to do about the house. This could be anything from having to be responsible for taking the trash out for a week, to having to take the dogs on extra walks, and yes, you can even take this in a more sadistic direction as well, because just because you're not doing physical punishment doesn't mean you can't feed your sadist side. While it's most effective to link the punishment to the transgression, like having to wash and fold all of the laundry for a week because they didn't pick up dirty socks, you can also be totally mean and arbitrary with it if you want to. Especially if part of the goal is to really reestablish the power in the relationship. This could be things like having to regrout everything in the bathroom, or scrubbing the kitchen tiles with a toothbrush for hours, or having to get through every nook and cranny of every cabinet to really scrub out the grime. Or if you want to be really mean, the dom could also spill an entire bag of rice into carpet, and then the submissive has to individually pick up every grain of rice. In this case, the more boring and time-consuming is the most effective for getting the message across. Especially if you're trying to work with a service submissive that would typically be rewarded by things like being allowed to do stuff around the house. Number 5 would be non-painful physical punishments. Just because you can't use pain doesn't mean you can't use physical discomfort as a motivator. In this video, I've really been using physical as shorthand for pain, but really physical punishment can go way beyond pain, just like sensation play isn't all pain. These could be things like making your submissive stand in a single wet sock, or having to hold an onion or a pepper in their mouth for swearing, or having to have their hands in a bucket of ice water, or being made to take an ice-cold shower. While these things are uncomfortable, they aren't usually painful in the way that motivates a bratty masochist to repeat their behavior to have the same stimulus again. Unless, of course, the bratty masochist is really only after attention. This is also great because it doesn't use BDSM tools, which means that you're not creating that negative fear association with certain BDSM implements, allowing you to keep discipline while preserving scenes as a fun, joyful experience. Number 6 would be sexual punishments. Now, I know that this will not be everybody's cup of tea, but for some people, sex is the primary motivator for doing BDSM, and because of that, the type of punishment that is most effective for them are things that are tied to sex. For example, not being allowed to masturbate, taking away their favorite vibrator, or no longer doing their favorite kind of sex for a period of time. If you don't already do this in your relationship, you might also have something where maybe they're not allowed to come without permission. This could also include things like chastity devices, having to wear a butt plug for a certain period of time, and yes, even orgasm torture. And you might think to yourself, how could orgasms ever be bad? And then suddenly it's been 3 hours and you're cramping and dehydrated and you're numb, and it really stopped feeling good 2.5 hours ago. So yes, orgasms can also be torture too. And those are really all of my suggestions for alternatives to corporal punishments. Hopefully you guys found this helpful. I would want everybody to keep in mind that punishment is a very individual experience. We all have different things that we are motivated by. We all have different fears and backgrounds. Our parents disciplined us in different ways, and all of those things can contribute to what is the most effective form of punishment. So just keep in mind, you might need to experiment. You're going to have to be open to feedback, and I do think that it is really important after you do punishment scenes to have a time for decompression and debriefing and feedback, just to make sure that we aren't going too far, but are going far enough that the lesson lesson is learned. And so yeah, that is everything from me. If you guys have any comments, questions, other punishments that you know have worked really well for you, I would love to hear what you all have to say down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this, if you haven't already, please do subscribe. I make videos twice a week about all sorts of kink and BDSM related topics. And finally, if you really enjoyed this, if you want to support what I do, please go ahead and check me out over on Patreon. That is what makes this video possible, as well as all of the videos on my channel. We are currently trying to make our way towards 1,000 patrons, so please help us reach that goal if you would like to. If you already support me over there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you guys next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.